Look, you want to win in fantasy football, you got to have that huge upside players who could give you that big game. These are the guys we think could do it in week 5. And while you're setting those fantasy lineups, don't forget to get your pick'ems in on Underdog. If for some reason you haven't signed up on Underdog yet, it's still a great time to do it because you can get this free pick'em on Thursday night. Kirk Cousins just going higher than 0.5 total yards. That's right. If you sign up for Underdog right now, you get this free pick'em. Plus, you still get that offer up to $1,000 bonus cash for your initial deposit if you use code ENDGAME when you sign up. All right, Chris, start us off. Who's your first pick for this week?
My first pick is going to be running back Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. I know it's been 3 kind of okay games. I guess in week 2, the first game of Malik Willis, he wasn't bad. He had a lot of yards. He didn't have a lot of fantasy points, but that's the thing here. He's had to play 2 games with Malik Willis where the Packers were running this kind of offense, very conservative offense. And then last week, what did we see? Minnesota just rolls the Packers early, and the Packers are just forced to chuck the ball and throw the ball a ton, and he kind of got game scripted out. But even last week, he still led this team in carries. He still had all the running back targets in this backfield last week. He's still getting 65% of the carries on the season, almost 60% of the targets on the season. And this week, I'm not worried about any of that stuff I already mentioned. First of all, he gets a great matchup against the Rams. They've been destroyed by running backs this year. You look at it, week 1, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery combined for 131 yards and 2 touchdowns. Week 2, James Conner, 122 yards and a touchdown. Week 3, Jordan Mason didn't have a huge fantasy game, but he had a productive running game. And then what did we see last week? DeAndre Swift. Yes, DeAndre Swift, 93 yards and a touchdown out of nowhere. This defense cannot stop running backs right now, and I'm also not worried about the Packers falling way behind and Josh Jacobs getting game scripted out. Now, I know Emmanuel Wilson does have a role in this offense, but Jacobs is still the clear number 1 running back. He's getting the bulk of the carries. When they get near the goal line, it's going to be Josh Jacobs. This is a prime bounce back spot for Josh Jacobs in a smash matchup in a game the Packers should be winning pretty much throughout, or at least close to competitive. So if Josh Jacobs has let you down the last 3 weeks, don't worry. This is the week he bounces back in a big way. And I also think he's going to bounce back on Underdog. I love his line there on those pick'ems. You talked about it, that Kirk Cousins free customer special. Why not pair it with this Josh Jacobs pick? He only needs to go higher than 59.5 yards this year. He's done that twice. And even last week, when he only had 9 carries against the Vikings, 51 yards. I think this week he can definitely do it. If you're new to Underdog, make sure you sign up using promo code ENDGAME, because not only is that going to get you that Kirk Cousins new customer special, but also up to $1,000 in bonus cash.
All right, I'm going to go with a running back also coming off of a down week. James Cook. Let's look at the fact that throughout the first part of the season, James Cook is a top 10 fantasy running back in PPR leagues. In fact, he's 8th in total fantasy points. You cannot let one down game just ruin your perception of him. He's pretty much a must start in most fantasy leagues. But I'll tell you what, I'm not scared about this matchup. Some people will think, well, it's the Texans. That's not, a great matchup for a running back. And what if Houston puts up points on them? Look, I don't think it's going to happen here. Yeah, it could go back and forth. It'll be a close game. Buffalo wants to run the ball. They don't want to just have to chuck it. And look, right now, this Buffalo offense, remember, is different than it used to be ever since they switched offensive coordinators midway through last season. They're going to be a little bit more under control. They don't want Josh Allen making those mistakes. They're going to establish the run. And against a potent offense like Houston, I think they're definitely going to try to do that early. Buffalo has more rush attempts on this season than pass attempts. I think we're going to see them, again, try to establish the run with James Cook first and foremost. And there's nothing about this matchup that's really going to scare me away. Cook has that touchdown upside. He's involved as a pass catcher. And I think this is a big bounce back for him because that's all he needs. Look, other than the one game where Buffalo happened to fall behind early and big and just couldn't even try to run the ball, James Cook is pretty much automatic for fantasy points. Don't question it. You got James Cook. You should be in store for another big game. All right, now, Thursday night's not always known for big point totals, but you think there's at least one player who could deliver.
Yeah, last week it was a Mike Evans week. I think this week is a Chris Godwin week. You look at this matchup against Atlanta, you think, okay, this isn't like a defense to take advantage of for wide receivers, but they give up the 3rd highest target share to slot wide receivers and the 7th most points to slot wide receivers. You look at Chris Godwin on the season, He has run 65% of his routes out of the slot this year. This is why he has been so good. We talked about it all offseason. And you look at other slot wide receivers this year against Atlanta. Devonta Smith, he runs 50% of his routes from the slot. 7 catches, 76 yards, and a touchdown against the Falcons. Rashee Rice, you may not know, runs 51% of his routes from the slot. 12 catches, 110 yards, and a touchdown. And what did we see last week? Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed combined 16 catches and 170 yards against this defense. Look, Mike Evans, I'm sure, will still be fine, but I think Chris Godwin is the one who feasts this week against this Atlanta defense that gets torched by slot wide receivers. He's got the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. He's been mostly great this year. Last week, his first kind of down week, but don't worry, he bounces back and is once again one of the top scoring wide receivers in week 5.
Well, let's keep that theme going. It's going to be a recurring theme throughout not only this video, but on the booms each week. We're going to pick on some bad defenses with some good receivers. I'm going to start with the Jaguars. Clearly not a good team this year. And specifically, they're giving up the 5th most fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position. And that's both inside, outside. Doesn't matter. If you're a wide receiver, go ahead and have a good time against the Jags. I would just say right now, it doesn't matter who Indianapolis has a quarterback. I'm starting Michael Pittman. Michael Pittman, yes, that Michael Pittman who a lot of people were ready to just give up on, and some people went ahead and dropped or sold low on him. Well, Michael Pittman finally made you regret that with a nice week 4. Now, part of that maybe was due to Joe Flacco coming in and slinging the ball like he does, but Pittman had already put up some numbers even before that, yes, with Anthony Richardson at quarterback. And so I'll just say, either way, that's not, this pick isn't contingent on Joe Flacco, although I prefer Joe Flacco at quarterback. Despite what seems like just a down season overall for Pittman until week 4, he's top 20 among all receivers in first read percentage. That means they're looking for him early and often. And he's tied for 8th in targets per route run. The targets have been there, it just hadn't come together. He's finally awakened. This Colts offense is going to take advantage of this Jags defense. And so I'm going to say you got Michael Pittman. Yes, just put him back in your lineup. Don't look at last week as a fluke. Look at those first couple of weeks as the fluke. All right, a lot of people need help at quarterback. Is there someone that we could find out there that could save us?
Maybe. Brock Purdy's still available in a lot of fantasy leagues, and I think he's in store for a huge game. It kind of feels like he's been on the cusp of a big game, and when you look at on the season, believe it or not, Brock Purdy leads everybody in passing yards this year. He's only got 5 touchdowns, though. That's what's kept him from being like a fantasy stud this year and just kind of being good in fantasy. But I think this is the week that could change because he's going against the Arizona Cardinals. We just saw Jaden Daniels torch this defense, and not just with his legs, he torched this defense through the air as well. And you look at last year, Brock Purdy against the Cardinals. First game, 283 yards and a touchdown. Second game, 242 yards and 4 touchdowns. I'm not scared of this defense. It's not really any better than it was last year when he faced them. And this 49ers offense finally starting to get healthy. I mean, no, there's still no Christian McCaffrey, of course, but he's got Jordan Mason out of the backfield. But Debo should be fully healthy now. Brandon Ayuk at some point is going to have a big game. Maybe it's this week. And look, Juwan Jennings has started to show that he can be a reliable wide receiver 3 in this offense. So I think with the weapons around him against this defense, what he did to him last year, and really what he's been doing this year minus the touchdowns, Brock Purdy is finally in store for that big game. Maybe this is the week he has a multi-touchdown game and really delivers for your fantasy team. I think in this matchup, he's got to be one of the best streaming options at quarterback, some of the most upside at quarterback this week.
All right, so in week 4, we told you if you have a better option, and there were a lot of other options at wide receiver, you could go ahead and bench Garrett Wilson. And this week, I'm going to tell you, you need to start Garrett Wilson. All right, so what has changed? It's funny because you might look at the matchup, and of course, we want to avoid Pat Surtain and the Broncos, any wide receiver 1 going against him. Yeah, okay, just sit him, right? A lot of people look at this week's matchup, Minnesota Vikings, and Minnesota has gotten a lot of hype, look, justifiably so. The offense has been clicking. Sam Darnold is legit, and that defense is doing some things, but this is not a shutdown defense. I feel on the one hand, yes, they deserve, with the accolades they've gotten. Brian Flores at coordinator, he's done a great job, but I think the hype is getting a little out of hand because, yes, they get sacks. Yes, they can confuse a quarterback, and yes, they're putting up fantasy points as a defense, but they're actually giving up the third most points to wide receivers. There are some wide receivers that are going off against them. And I know last week with Green Bay, you say, well, it was garbage time, it come from behind time. Look, at some point we have to stop excusing this. It's 2 weeks in a row that's happened, and they've given up big plays and big games to wide receivers consistently. And we're talking Garrett Wilson here. Now, I know he and Aaron Rodgers have not exactly been on the same page lately. It's going to happen. You have to remain patient when you have a stud receiver like this. Just like a guy like Michael Pittman has finally come through, just like a Christian Kirk is finally coming through, Garrett Wilson is going to come through here. And I will just say this with Minnesota specifically, Garrett Wilson is one of those receivers that doesn't just sit in the same position. He'll move in the slot. In fact, 40% of the time, a little bit more than that, he's in the slot. So is Allen Lazard. Minnesota's defense, one thing that's unique about them is they deploy that too high, which some analysts just rail against, the highest rate in the league. That leaves the zone open across the middle for receivers to sometimes to feast here as far as those short targets. So I don't know if Garrett Wilson is necessarily going to have these huge long touchdowns in store, but I think the volume is going to be there. They're going to have to pass the ball at some point, right? The Jets, they're not facing the Broncos this week. They're facing Minnesota. The passing is going to be there. Garrett Wilson, I think, finally has his biggest game of the season, and I want a part of it. If you didn't catch our start sit advice at every position for fantasy week 5, it's all right here in this week's playlist.